Hi, I'm Dennis Metzler, and welcome to The Charge. Today we are looking at the nature of a human person. So we're with Dr. Joshua Rasmussen. He is professor of philosophy at Azusa Pacific University and the author of many books, including the one we're taking a look at today, which is Who Are You Really?, published by IVP in 2023. So, Dr. Rasmussen, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's great to be with you. I'm excited for our conversation.
Good, good. So I first discovered you, I was listening to an interview of William Lane Craig, and he mentioned you as an up-and-coming apologist philosopher that people should take note of. So that's how we're connected here. So,
Cool.
so first of all, if you could just give the audience a general idea of your background in terms of theology, your church background, etc., so people know where you're coming from.
Yeah, thank you. So I would say fundamentally, I'm an explorer. So I'm always trying to understand more about reality. And this desire to explore leads me to explore, including, the nature of God. Who is God? What does that word even mean? And I feel like I'm constantly kind of upgrading my understanding of these things. I was raised in a household where my parents gave me a feeling of being loved and being free. And I think that's really good for an explorer to feel loved and to feel free. So I wasn't just like set loose to be free without feeling, loved. And I wasn't just loved, but then like, trapped into a certain set of confines. I think that's helped me in my theological and church experiences. So church background, my wife and I, we've been part of various denominations, and I think that's helped us to kind of feel out different sort of perspectives within the Christian worldview, and then theologically, even that idea of love and freedom, I think even shows up in my concept of God, that God is a loving being, and that God relates to us in a way that honors and respects our freedom. And so I would say those are some highlights of my background.
So which church ecclesial traditions most closely represent, or maybe two or three represent where you're coming from?
Yeah, so well, my background from my parents is a kind of broadly evangelical free church, not evangelical in the political sense, but more in the
Right.
sort of theological sense. And then my wife and I have been in more charismatic streams as well, and that's been more recent for us. And so I don't feel like my own like sense of identity is like anchored to any of those. It's more to maybe what C.S. Lewis would call mere Christianity. But those would be some examples. Yeah.
All righty. Okay, so let's dive into the book. So what is the main argument of the book? And you look at, you introduce the inquiry, right? And you discuss three tools of inquiry: introspection, reason, and scientific method. So if you could go into more detail about all that.
Yeah, this is great because to investigate the topic, so trying to understand like who are we? Who are we really like in the depths? Like who am I? Who are you, right? And one thing that I would observe about myself is that I have this capacity to be conscious, to be aware. So whatever I am, I'm the kind of thing that can be conscious. And then, so the book is all about, investigating what that kind of a thing that is. And to even get started on this inquiry, what I want to do is sort of investigate, I call it the cave of consciousness, which is my metaphor for the exploration into the nature of conscious beings. And I want to have some tools to bring light into the cave of consciousness. And so there you mentioned the three tools that I want to use, one being introspection, another being reason, another being a scientific method. So introspection, I think of this as a light by which we can sort of look within, be aware of having thoughts, having feelings, being someone who has thoughts and feelings. So there's the someone that I can be aware of. And so that's a very, very important light. That's a tool that I'm going to kind of use as my kind of theme tool throughout the book. Then I've got reason, which lets me deduce implications of the data that I collect through introspection, right? So like if I introspectively am aware of a thought and I notice that a thought is about something, then I can use reason to deduce that if something is not about something, like if there's a rock or a pile of rocks and that rock is not about anything, well, then that rock can't be a thought, okay? Because of logic, right? So logic helps me see that. And then the scientific method is sort of a way of organizing my data so that I'm trying to find a hypothesis that best fits all of my data within the constraints of reason. And so you'll see throughout the journey, I'm trying to collect data, use reason, and then come up with a working hypothesis that sort of best explains all of that. And those are the tools. And I really do believe that those tools will get you very, very far in the cave of consciousness. You can really uncover a lot about who you are. And one of the things I talk about are obstacles to even a confidence to find out anything because everybody's disagreeing. This is a deep topic. You're telling me before the show here that this is it's complicated territory. It's not necessarily one that maybe you've gone into a lot of depth in before. And like most people, even after they've gone into a lot of depth, find it like a large ocean to swim in. So how do we make progress in this large ocean? Now I'm mixing metaphors. Is it an ocean or is it a cave? But the idea is that it's complicated, and I think we can make progress with these tools.
Was there a fourth or fifth one, tools that you considered but rejected?
Great question. I didn't really. I mean, so I sort of think about it like this. I love this question because it points to the powers that you have to get to reality. And I think you have more than just a few powers. You've got lots of powers. You've got your eyes, you've got your ears, you've got all these different powers. I didn't want to include these other powers because they're kind of implicit in a way in the scientific tool. So the scientific tool is a tool by which you can collect data by any of your powers and then have a hypothesis that helps explain that. The reason why I highlighted introspection and reason is because those are tools that are, I feel like they're kind of the best tools to see things for yourself about consciousness and then to tease out the implications. They're the most relevant for this inquiry. So that's kind of how I was thinking about it.
All right. So in your attempt to describe human nature, you talk about feelings and the various theories of mind you describe. So what's relevant for us to understand there? And if you could give an overview of each of those theories of mind.
Yeah. So the question here is about who we are. And one part of this question is about kind of the nature of the mind or consciousness, right? And so what I try to do in this kind of early chapter is give the reader a sense of kind of the playground of options, So philosophers have been working out these different theories to understand, okay, what's an option for how to think about the mind? And you can kind of divide all the theories really into three main ones. And then I can subdivide each of those. But the three main ones that I would kind of divide the theories into would be either a kind of eliminativist theory, which sort of says that you don't have a mind. It eliminates aspects of mind that you would sort of associate with a mind. So, maybe you don't have thoughts, you don't have feelings. The way that I would think about it is there's nothing that really takes place in consciousness. What there is maybe atoms in motion, molecular machines, but there's not this sort of realm of conscious awareness or the things that take place in consciousness. So that's eliminativism. Then there's reductionism, which says, no, there actually are elements of consciousness. There actually is consciousness and there's contents of consciousness. You have real thoughts within your consciousness. You have real feelings. Those are real. But what those things are is going to be reduced to or analyzed in terms of brain activity, basically, or states of matter, where these states of matter are themselves ultimately based in mindless bits of reality, things that are unconscious, things that don't have a mind. So in a way, on this sort of reductionist account, the mindless is the primary reality, and you can analyze the mental in terms of the mindless. Okay. And then you have what you might call a something more view, which is that you do have a mind. So we're not eliminating it, but your mind does not reduce to brain activity. There's something more to you than just molecular motions and molecular functions. And so those would be kind of three main theories of mind. And then, as you know from the book and as anybody can imagine, each of those theories subdivides into other fine-tuned theories. But I think it's helpful just to kind of divide it there and then talk kind of about, pros and cons of those different theories. my approach in the book is to argue first against the eliminativism, then against the reductionism, and then that leads to the something more view. And then the question is, well, okay, what is this something more? How does it fit into reality?
What are your key thoughts about those first two?
Yeah, right.
Why aren't they sufficient?
Yeah. So now both of those first two open up a whole just course load of ideas and questions and considerations. But just to be brief, to give a summary about my thoughts about it, the elimination view, I think the main weakness of eliminating consciousness is that I think that it does contradict our own immediate experience of reality. So I think one of the aspects of reality that is part of what we know is our experience of reality. We can actually experience our own experience, if that makes sense. So let me just draw this out. So if I have a thought in my mind, so like right now I'm like thinking about zebras, okay? Now, we could ask whether my thought about zebras is about something real. Like, are the zebras real? Well, probably they are. But, maybe they're all wiped out. Maybe there aren't any zebras. Okay. But whether there are any zebras or not, I'm aware of my thought about zebras. The thought is real. Okay. The thought is really in my mind, and I'm aware of that. Now, I don't have to check my brain to be aware of my thought. I just use that light of introspection. This is why that tool of introspection is so important, because it's the light by which you can be aware of things within consciousness. And so I would argue that this tool lets me experience my consciousness of my thoughts. And it lets me experience my thoughts. It lets me experience itself. I can be aware of these elements in consciousness. So I would say the fundamental problem with eliminating consciousness is that it doesn't take into account this power to be aware of things in consciousness. Now, I want to be careful about this because in the book, I talk about how eliminativists would attempt to take into account, the tool of introspection. One way is to try to talk about how that tool of introspection isn't actually revealing reality. It's not telling us what's actually there. But my argument is that in order to know anything, even in the sciences, you've got to have some awareness of your own elements of your mind. Because in science, you form hypotheses. Well, how do you know what hypothesis you formed unless you're aware of something within your own mind? Thought in your mind, which is a hypothesis. You make observations, but how do you know that you've made an observation unless you're aware of yourself making an observation? That awareness of making an observation is an awareness of an experience, which is using introspection. So this is a summarized, argument for why I think introspection lets you eliminate eliminativism, or in other words, how you can know that you have some consciousness. And then with respect to reductionism, this sort of second option, there's many different forms of reductionism, but sort of all of them, I think, fail what I call a direct comparison test. So I think that we have a power to directly compare some aspects of consciousness. For example, I can compare feeling love for you with the shape of a dinosaur. And if the shape of a dinosaur is in my awareness and the feeling is in my awareness, I can see that those aren't the same thing. This is unlike when Lois Lane is tricked that she thinks Superman is not Clark Kent. How is she tricked there? Well, it's because she doesn't have awareness into the inner essence of the guy who's wearing glasses and the guy who's rescuing her from buildings or whatever. She only experiences Clark Kent as he appears to her. So she can't directly compare. She doesn't have that inner access to his essence. Whereas, see, this is where consciousness is different. I do have access to the experience of a thought. And so I can directly compare that experience with, let's say, a shape that I also have direct access to, direct awareness of a shape. And so this is where I would argue that by being aware of your consciousness, you can directly compare and you can see, oh, okay, your consciousness is different from a pattern of brain activity. It's different from a pattern of particles in your brain. It's connected to it, but it can't be the same thing, because if it's the same thing, then you would be able to be aware of the brain activity consciously while you're aware of your feelings. But Alec, I'm not aware of my brain activity while I'm aware of my feelings. I know this by direct comparison. I can directly compare my awareness of my feelings and then my awareness of brain activity. I can see that those aren't the same. So that's a way that I would argue against both elimination and reduction.
And so both of those, elimination and reduction, would all be 100% materialist, or?
Well, so you can be a materialist and be an eliminativist. You can be a materialist and a reductionist. Those would be common materialist views. But you could also be a materialist and join me in thinking that there's something more to you than matter and motion. The way this works is you could have what's called a non-reductive materialist view. So, for example, one version of non-reductive materialism would be what's sometimes called dual aspect theory, where you have maybe a conscious psychological aspect that's not itself analyzed in terms of material aspects in physics. So you call it immaterial, but it is connected to and even grounded in a more fundamental material reality. So, kind of at this stage in the inquiry, if people follow me along to this point, that there's something more to you than matter and motion, there's still a choice point between kind of like whether matter is more fundamental or whether the immaterial is more fundamental. And so, and here I'm using material to talk about sort of mindless, fundamentally mindless material. So things that are, material things that don't have sort of consciousness, right? That these things give rise to consciousness. That would be kind of a mindless first materialism. And you can be a mindless first materialist and think that there are immaterial realities like consciousness that emerge. So that's one of the options. And we'll be talking about that because that comes up later in the book. I start to investigate that.
Okay, and let me see. Let's look then at move on to thoughts, unless there's anything else to cover on feelings, do you think?
That's good enough for now. That's all I have. I mean, there's always more, but.
Okay, so on your thoughts about thoughts then, you cover their four aspects. And so also you do something interesting with counting arguments. So if you could cover those.
Yeah, so in the section on thoughts, I'm trying to understand kind of another aspect that shows up in consciousness. So it's not just that we have feelings, we also have the ability to think about things. And again, the theories of feelings will divide those three groups. You can eliminate, the theory of thoughts. You can eliminate thoughts. You can reduce thoughts. You could say, no, there's something more to thoughts than just, chemistry in your brain. And so one thing that I try to do is I try to give the reader multiple tools to investigate, or multiple, I guess it's strategies for investigating. So it's not just the direct comparison test that we can use to see that there's something more to consciousness than material motions. There's this other strategy, which I call the counting argument. So the counting argument is a strategy for investigating the nature of thoughts using a kind of mathematical analysis. Do you want me to summarize the actual counting argument?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So now this is one of the most advanced parts of the book. And I try to set it up in stages. This is kind of my original contribution to the field. I have a series of publications on trying to understand the nature and origin of thoughts by studying their mathematical properties. And let me just say, I first got this idea. I was just having breakfast. I remember it was Rice Krispies. And I was just like eating this bowl of cereal. I mean, I wasn't eating the bowl of cereal. I was eating the cereal in the bowl. And this idea came into my mind about thoughts. I had this picture of a conceptual landscape of thoughts and then overlaying a mountain range. Okay, that was like how the idea looked in my mind. And all of a sudden, I just like got this idea. I was like, how many types of conceivable conceptual landscapes are there compared to the number of types of conceivable mountain ranges, or more specifically, material landscapes, okay, or material states? And that question led me down a path to discovering this counting argument. So the way the counting argument works is it seeks to show that there are actually more ways to make thoughts than there are ways to make material states. Both are infinite, but what Cantor showed us, this mathematician who is famous for his developments in infinity, he showed us that some infinities are bigger than others. Now, like I said, this is an advanced argument here, but if you just think about the infinity of the whole numbers, so like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up. I'm not going to count all of them, but there's infinitely many. You compare that infinity to the infinity of the decimal numbers, or the rational numbers. So 1.1, 1.11, 1.145, all those. Well, it turns out that you can show that the infinity of the decimal numbers is larger than the infinity of the whole numbers. It's a bigger infinity. And the way Cantor shows this is that for each decimal number, you can find a unique whole number that you can map the decimal number to, but you can't go the other way. You can't for each, no, I said that backwards. For each whole number, you can find a decimal number to match to, but you can't for each decimal number find a unique whole number to match to.
Right.
So there's going to be leftover decimals. And so I use a similar strategy to argue that for each one of the material states, you can find a thought that you can map to that material state, but you can't go the other direction. There's actually thoughts left over that you can't map in the other direction. And so this will show that the mathematics of thoughts is like greater than the mathematics of material states. And then you can use that result to deduce that there's something about thoughts that's not reducible to the material. And I even argue through kind of a more elaborated argument that you can't even like make thoughts just out of the material. Like there's just too many to make. And by kind of uniformity principle, I make the argument you can't really make any of them. The material stuff can help facilitate thoughts, but it can't be the only ingredient to making the thought. So how do I establish that there are more thoughts possible than possible material states? It's actually kind of easy. In a way, I mean, it's kind of easy because you just take any material state and then you can define a conceivable thought that's about that material state. So like take the material state of your brain right now, then there's a conceivable thought that is conceptually about all the different parts of your brain state. And when I say it's a conceivable thought, what I mean is there's no logical contradiction in describing that thought. There's no logical contradiction. So the goal of the argument is to show that there are more sort of logically coherent thoughts than logically coherent material states. For any logically coherent material state, there's a logically coherent thought that describes that state. And this is also true for collections of material states. You take any collection of material states, and there could be a complex thought about each member of that collection. There's no contradiction there. And so I really try to draw this out in detail in the book, in even more detail in some of my technical published work. And what I try to show then is that it now follows from Cantor's theorem applied to infinities that there are more conceivable thoughts than conceivable material states. And this again leads to this grand result that you can't reduce thinking to materiality. There's something more to thinking than materiality.
Okay. And then how about the four aspects? You have aboutness, structure, truth value, and logical linkability.
So these aspects, thanks for asking me this, because these aspects of thoughts are so helpful to discern because they also independently, I think, show that thoughts aren't reducible to material states, at least not describable in our ordinary vocabulary of physics in terms of shape and position and momentum. There's something else. So I make the argument that you can be aware of your thoughts by introspecting on your thought and then noticing these aspects. So thoughts have the aspect of being about things. That's one of the aspects. If I think about zebras, that thought has the property of being about zebras. Okay, well, how do I know that? Well, because I can just inspect the thought right in my mind. It's like this is the ground of knowledge. You can just know things right directly in your mind. So I can see in my mind that thoughts are about things. That's one of the aspects. Another is thoughts have a logical structure to them. So the thought that the cat is on the mat is different from the thought that the mat is on the cat. They have the same conceptual components, cat, mat, and on, But those thoughts are different because they have a different structure. There's a different organization of those conceptual components. So that's another aspect of thinking, that, like structure is part of thinking. They have a truth value, meaning that thoughts can accurately be accurate, or inaccurate. Um, and they also have logical links that allow thoughts to be able to link with other thoughts through logic. For example, you can have the thought that there's a zebra or that there's a lion, and the or there is a logical link that links up those thoughts so you can make a more complicated thought about those atomic thoughts. And yeah, so those are some aspects of thoughts. And again, you can use direct comparison tests to see, okay, well, is or the same as being a triangle? Well, get the triangle in your mind, get the or in your mind, and then just compare them. Are they the same? They're not the same. Okay, you can just see that. I use the example of a triangle because it's easy, it's simple. But I think you can also see that there's no pattern of particles in your brain that is identical to or, the logical relation of or. There are particles that can function, to simulate an or gate or an or relation. But that's different than the logical relation of or that you can know right within your thoughts. There's a difference there. So, yeah, so I think that you can know these aspects of thoughts through introspection, and that's how you can know something about your thoughts.
Okay. And we get onto sight. Fascinating chapter. So you have 4 theories of perception. So if you could go over those 4, and then why is it all relevant?
Yeah. So in that chapter, I'm trying to figure out how you see things. Sight is one of those familiar things that might sort of seem obvious that you see things. Like you look outside, you see the sun. It's like, okay, but how does that work? And so I start with a puzzle that these 4 theories are designed to help us to think about. And the puzzle is about how it is that you're able to get outside of your own mind to see something that is not just in your mind. So you see the sun. Is the sun in your mind? Well, presumably not. I mean, it's out there, not in your mind. But then how do you actually see it? Like, let's say you have a vivid dream, and in your dream, you have an experience of the yellow and of the circle of the sun. And imagine the dream is kind of indiscernible to an awake experience of the sun. You can't even really tell the difference. It's just indistinguishable. You think you're awake, okay? And then you wake up and you realize, oh, you were just dreaming. So everything that you thought you were aware of in your mind was just in your mind. It wasn't actually outside of your mind. It was a dream object of a sun. Now you're awake and you look up and you see the sun, but you notice that what you're consciously aware of when you're seeing the sun is including the same aspects that you're aware of while you're dreaming. There's the yellow of the sun, the circle of the sun, all those aspects you're aware of while you're dreaming. Or at least the experience of those aspects is not distinguishable from your experience of those aspects when you're awake. So the question now is, how is it that you're actually aware of something outside of your mind if everything that you're aware of is indistinguishable from what you're aware of while you're dreaming that was in your mind? This is a kind of distinguishability problem. How can you distinguish the awareness of things in your mind from the awareness of things outside of your mind? How does that work? So one of the theories that tries to answer this is called direct realism. So the direct realist says, when you look out at the sun, you are just directly consciously aware of the sun. And, but then the question for the direct realist is, again, how can you distinguish what you're directly consciously aware of from the things that you're directly consciously aware of when you're dreaming? It looks like they're the same kinds of things. The color, the shape. This is why you can have a dream and not know that you're awake. Now, look, I mean, I understand there are differences between dreaming and being awake, but a lot of these differences that people point to are differences in degree. It's a degree of control or like degree of blurriness. But you can imagine, right, like a perfect hallucination where it's stimulated in you perfectly and maybe from birth, so you never wake up, and there's no way to distinguish that from being awake. Or if you do wake up, it was, perfect hallucination. There's no real way to distinguish it. So how does the direct realist account for this indistinguishability between your dream experience and your awake experience? One answer is that some people, it's called disjunctivism. They say when you're dreaming, you're not actually aware, you're not perceiving those things. When you're awake, you are aware. I explore this option, but I think it doesn't really pull out the root of the problem, because I'm wondering, okay, well, what am I aware of when I'm dreaming? Because if you're saying it's not the sun, it's not just nothing. The reason I can distinguish a dream of a moon from a dream of a sun is because I was aware of different things when I was dreaming of the moon from the dreaming of the sun. There's got to be something there that's different. What I end up arguing is that the direct realist, in a way, if I try to draw out what's valuable about each of the theories. So it's not that I, in the end, saying the direct realism doesn't get anything right. I think it does get something right. I think it gets right that you can be aware of things that don't depend on your awareness of them. Okay. I think it gets that right. We call these external things. They don't depend on your awareness of them. But I don't think it really solves on its own that distinguishability problem. It doesn't really help us to see how you can see the sun if the elements that you're seeing when you look outside are the same elements, the color, the shape that you see in your own mind when you're dreaming. It almost looks like the sun is literally that you're seeing is in your mind, and that what's outside of your mind, you're actually not conscious of it at all. It's just something else that's causing you to be having the sun experience. So then this leads me to a theory, next option, called phenomenalism, right? So we talk about direct realism, seeing directly the external world. Phenomenalism basically says you're actually not directly conscious of anything in the external world. The only thing you're conscious of are things in your own mind. So if you kind of think of like the principal challenge for the direct realist is to understand how you can be, if you're aware of things out there, then how can you be aware of things within that are similar to things out there? For the phenomenalist, the challenge is to understand, well, how could you be aware of anything outside of your mind? How could you even say that the sun is different from the things that you're aware of in your mind if you're not even aware of anything outside of your mind? The way I describe this in the book is that the phenomenalist sort of treats the things you're aware of as like paintings within your mind. So when you're aware of the tree, you're actually just aware of a representation in your mind. It's like a painting inside your mind. Although you can't even say it's a representation, because you can't really say how it's related to anything outside your mind. You're not aware of anything outside your mind. So this is the phenomenalist idea. You're just aware of paintings in your mind. And so the question is, how can you then know anything outside of your mind? All you know is what's in your mind. So then the two next theories are the intentional theory and the representational theory. I should say that there are ways of mix and matching these theories. These aren't necessarily mutually exclusive theories. But the intentional theory would basically say that you can have these states of consciousness that are about external states, and then you can be aware of these external states by having these states of consciousness that are about these external states. So the way that I'm aware of the sun is by being, one version of this would be an adverbial theory, which says that I'm aware, I'm having an experience of being appeared to sunly. That's like a way of putting it. I'm having this sun experience. And then the sun experience is about the sun. And so I'm aware of the sun by having this certain kind of conscious experience. The representationalist would say that I'm having an experience that represents the external world. And so I'm perceiving the external world by having an experience that represents the external world. But now I have the challenges for those theories as well. Okay, right? So I've got challenges for all the theories. A challenge for the adverbial, I'm going to do these together, the adverbial theory and the representational theory, is I really just don't see how those theories on their own solve the deeper problem of how you can be aware consciously of things external to your mind. You could just say that they represent, your image of the sun represents the sun, but that's almost like just labeling the mystery to me. It doesn't really say like how is it then that the sun out there is related to you say it represents, but what does that really mean? I mean, is it that there's an actual color, a yellow color that's out there in the world that's the same as the yellow color that's in my mind? Um, or is it that the thing that's in my mind is just a color experience and then out there in the world is something categorically different from an experience? Well, what is that? So I offer a theory then that kind of pulls from the strengths, I would say, of those four theories of perception. And I call this the window theory of perception. And according to the window theory, you actually have direct conscious access to aspects of reality, like looking through a window. And some of these aspects are aspects of you, and some of these are aspects that don't depend on you. So aspects of you would be like your thoughts, your feelings, your visual images. Aspects that don't depend on you would include such things as logical relations, mathematical truths. You can have direct conscious awareness of mathematical truths. And then I sort of leave open the idea that maybe the shapes and colors that you're aware of with your eyes, maybe they exist in a landscape that doesn't depend on your awareness of them. I say maybe because, to be honest, I mean, this is kind of like an open question for me. Whether the shapes and colors that you're aware of actually exist apart from your awareness, or whether those things depend on your awareness, that's open-ended. But I show in the book how you could argue that these things exist beyond your awareness. And what's clear to me is that you have this window of consciousness that can be aware of aspects, and some of these aspects depend on you, and then some of them don't. And then that leaves open further questions about, well, which aspects depend on you, which ones don't. That I'm kind of leaving for the reader to explore kind of by their own lights, if that makes sense. But what's the clearest that I offer is that you have a power to perceive through direct conscious awareness of aspects of reality. And so this is my theory of perception. It's the window theory of direct conscious awareness of aspects of reality.
All right. And then your understanding of the will and elements of freedom, and you talk about the ability to choose and how to make a choice. So if you could fill all that in with some detail.
Okay, sure. Yeah. And please, do feel free to interact with anything that I share, because I know this is very complicated stuff, and I'm going to try to give you my summary here. We're kind of moving through the different aspects of you, right? So there's your feelings, there's your thoughts, there's your power to perceive the world. These are all very, very special aspects of you. And I think sometimes we take for granted the familiar things. It's like feelings are familiar, thinking is familiar, even just like looking at the sun is familiar. But these are very, very special things. And I think the specialness comes to light through this kind of analysis. So the next thing you're inviting me to look at is the power to choose, right? Another one of these familiar things that I can do something in the world. I can like raise my hand. I can blink my eyes. I can move my finger 3 times in a row. 1, 2, 3. Like, look what I just did. The power that I have to do that. How do I do that, right? How do I do that? And so for each chapter, I kind of like to start with a puzzle that helps to generate curiosity, helps the reader to understand a little bit of what's at stake. How could you even do anything in the world? And the puzzle that I present is what you might call a puppet puzzle. It's the puzzle of how you're not a mere puppet of other things that pull the strings. See, one way to think about this is if you have consciousness and you have a power to use your consciousness to do things in the world, how can you do that if mindless states really do pull the strings? Like if particles pull the strings and all that you do, how can you do anything? And this takes us back to that mindless first materialism that we were talking about earlier. So let's say that consciousness is real. We're not eliminating it. It doesn't reduce to the mindless. But then there's this question about, okay, if it doesn't reduce to the mindless, does the mindless pull the strings in all of your behavior? Here's a reason to think not. If the mindless pulled the strings in all your behavior, then you would be a mere puppet. But I make the argument from both science and introspection that actually there's good evidence that you have some power to make a difference. I think you can actually sort of verify this, or at least get some evidence for this, just by paying attention to your own doing of things. Like if I say, okay, I'm gonna bend this finger 4 times. Well, how do I know I'm gonna do that? Well, I'm aware of this state of wanting to demonstrate something, and then I'm aware of my power to act on that state. And then here's the manifestation. One, two, three, four. I created that physical manifestation in the world based on a mental state. This is like mind over matter, right? It's mind moving matter right within your own body. And I think this is evidence that mind does play a role. It's not just mindless stuff pulling the strings. Mind actually has some kind of power to make a difference. And this power is so important because if you can recognize your power, then you'll use that power. So this is part of what I do in that chapter is I make an argument for your power, and then I try to kind of draw out the aspects of that mental power, that it comes from you. You're an agent that can do it. I make the argument that you can actually make a choice between different options, and that you tap into that power, and you're, again, not just a mere puppet of mindless things. So any thoughts about that or questions about
Yeah,
anything?
so I mean, that seems so obvious from our own experience, right? So how can there even be an argument between the free will people and the determinists? Where do determinists get any ground to stand on?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think part of the challenge is to understand how you could fit into reality given a certain worldview, right? So if your worldview is a mindless first worldview, so you think that it's particles and fields and then things emerge out of that, then you've got to say that whatever you are is ultimately an emergent phenomenon out of mindless bits of reality that pull the strings and everything that you do, right? And so you might think of that as a kind of deterministic view in this respect. So I want to be clear. It's not that you think that everything is determined in the sense that there aren't alternative possibilities. It's that you think that the mindless stuff determines the mental stuff, right? Because it might be that we're in a quantum mechanical universe where the mindless stuff actually proceeds probabilistically from one mindless state to another, and there's actual options there. It's not just deterministic across time, but it is deterministic between the mindless and the mental. Like the mental does what it does because the mindless does what it does, right? It's because the mindless particles are moving along in a certain way that the mind has its properties. And if that is your worldview, you almost like have to somehow account for this kind of mindless determinism. Um, and I think that I kind of like how you put it in terms of it's obvious, because my method in philosophy is to ask myself, well, what's the most obvious? And then let that be the light into my worldview. So people come at this from different perspectives, but this is just kind of where I'm coming from. I do find it quite obvious that my mind can make a difference in the world. I mean, I notice myself thinking a certain thought. That thought leads to another thought. In fact, my theory of rationality is that in order for thinking to even be rational, reasoning has to make a difference in my thinking. Otherwise, if it's like mindless states moving my thoughts along, then I wouldn't say that those thoughts are ultimately, they wouldn't count as rational in my view. So I do find it kind of obvious when I think about it that mind can make a difference. But I also think that mind wouldn't make a difference if the mindless is first. So I kind of use this as an argument against the mindless being first. It's an argument for mind actually being first in the order of explaining the motions of things, at least things local to my behavior. So, I do think worldview comes in. People will have a certain worldview where the mind can't be first on that worldview. And that leads to the puzzle, I think.
So how far, though, do some hard determinists actually take it, though?
Well, tell me more about what you're thinking here in terms of how
In
far.
terms of discounting the notion of a free will. I mean, there's such obvious examples of our free will, but yet they'll still argue at some level for determinism. So,
I think I get the question. Yeah. So we can distinguish between hard determinism and then soft determinism. Right. So the hard determinist would say that if determinism is true, then there is no free will, and and determinism is true. And so therefore there is no free will. The soft determinist or the compatibilist would say that, well, okay, let me get clear on my terms here. The soft determinism will say determinism is true and compatibilism is true. So compatibilism is the thesis that determinism is compatible with free will. And so I think it's just kind of helpful to clarify those things, right? So um, my argument there in that chapter is an argument that technically allows for determinism across time. It actually allows for that, but it just basically says that even if you have determinism across time, you wouldn't be an agent making a difference in the world if you also had determinism from the mindless up to the mental. So in a way, I'm trying to kind of build my argument with modest assumptions. I'm not saying I think determinism is across time. I'm just saying, even if it were, you still have this problem of understanding how you as a mind can make a difference in the world if the mindless right now, I mean, like right in this moment, if chemical reactions are determined by mindless forces, then your thoughts right now are determined by the mindless. So the mind is determined by the mindless right now. And I just don't think that's compatible with genuine, well, there's freedom, but there's also just the mind being able to make a difference, right? So I don't think it's compatible with freedom or with mental causation. I think mental causation requires mind has to play a role. Can't just be a puppet of the mindless. But if you're a hard determinist, then you're going to resist all that. You're going to say, no, it's all just an illusion. Mind doesn't play a role. It's all just deterministic. But I'm going to argue against that. I just don't think that fits the data that I have.
It may seem like we're making free will choices, but that's where the illusion is, because everything has been determined.
Yeah.
Okay, there is a script. You just don't know you're following it.
Yeah, that's right. It's an illusion. You think that you can make a difference. But I mean, that's one of those theories where it's like, okay, well, if I'm weighing the evidence that I have and I'm noticing that I can explain my observations in terms of a mind first theory, I can explain my observation that my finger goes down 5 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Because I formed that intention to move it down 5 times. Why would I be a determinist? What motivation would I have? This gets into worldview, right? But I sort of think of it like this, like pick a worldview that best explains your observations, right? So for me, I'm just speaking from my perspective. It seems like a mind first theory just best explains my observations. So I don't have motivation to think that free will is an illusion. I don't have that motivation. I don't have any reason to posit these mindless, independent states that just exist on their own that can then pull the strings and everything. I don't have a reason to posit that. So I'm, in a sense, free from the mindless first theory of reality.
Okay. So the value of the human, it's such a struggle with so many of us at different times, understanding our value. So this is a really practical one. So what are the individual, the aspects of value, and what are some obstacles then in seeing our own value?
I would say that value is grounded in our nature. Call this intrinsic value. That's an aspect of value. There's also a kind of uniqueness to your value. So like if you were replaced by a clone, the clone would be able to copy the intrinsic value of your nature, but it wouldn't copy the unique value of you. So there'd still be something missing. There's something about you that's unique to you. I think it might have to do with your total history, or your sort of connection to God originally. And we can sort of leave that open, but I do think there's a kind of unique value that you have. And then we could talk about instrumental value, the value that that you produce. But I sort of focus on the intrinsic value there in that chapter. It's rooted in your nature, and there are different obstacles to that that kind of roll into the way of that. Like, so one obstacle would be that sometimes people would say, well, value is just purely in the eye of the beholder. It's just subjective. And if it's just subjective, well then, how can people have value sort of in their own right? Um, so that would be sort of an obstacle from the subjectivity of value. And there I would make an argument that, well, it seems like even if it's true that value has a kind of relationship to how it's experienced, still, it also seems true that there's something about the nature of a conscious being that grounds the valuing of that conscious being for its own sake. And I think we can understand this sort of intuitively. It's like if there's a 4-year-old girl and nobody values her, nobody recognizes her value. And let's say she herself doesn't recognize her value. That doesn't mean that, therefore, she doesn't have intrinsic value based on her nature. We could think about it this way. If we understood who she was, if we understood what her nature was, then we would be able to recognize the value that she has for her own sake. We would, in fact, value her, unless there were obstacles to that. So, yeah, so I would argue that we have value and that we can actually sort of see that value intuitively, I think.
So what are some of the other obstacles?
Well, now I think there are a number of obstacles. I actually don't even remember all the ones I discussed in that chapter. To be honest, I'd have to look at that again. But I can just tell you that one of the obstacles that does come up is a kind of epistemological obstacle of well, how could you even know that something has value? This is also related to the obstacle of materialism, that if you think things can only be known if they're analyzed in terms of material states, or you have to know them through scientific means, that's going to be a barrier to seeing your value. And my answer to and I think I do talk about those in the chapter, I think that to get past this, you got to use that tool of introspection. You got to realize that you have this power to be aware of value within. That if you limit yourself to material aspects or scientific means of investigation, then you're going to limit yourself from seeing important aspects of reality, including aspects that are required for science itself. We talked about this earlier, that, reasoning and being aware of your own observations, that involves awareness of things within. It requires introspection. And so if we can use the tool of introspection, then we can see that, oh, okay, this obstacle to seeing our value from sort of, let's say, scientism or materialism is actually blocking us from seeing some important aspects of reality.
All right, then. And what do you mean by the value puzzle?
This is a puzzle of understanding how it is that we could have, that you and I could have intrinsic value that is equal in a certain respect, right? What makes me valuable in the same way that you are valuable? I mean, to kind of draw this out, let's just say that I say to you, I'm more valuable than you are, okay? Here's how. I've got a better color of skin than you do. I've got hair that's better than yours. It's okay, but, you might feel like I've said something wrong. You might even be offended by what I'm saying, right? It's well, why? Why would you be feeling those things? It's because I think internally you're aware of a value of your nature that doesn't depend on the color of your skin or the color of your hair or the shape even of your body. But this does lead to a puzzle, because if we do have a shared value as persons, then what grounds that value in a sea of changing parts, changing colors, changing shapes? What really grounds our value? That's a puzzle, I would say, kind of for a materialist who analyzes things in terms of these changing material states. What is unchanging? And maybe what a materialist could say is what's unchanging is being you. Okay, but what is it to be you? And if we're going to analyze what it is to be you in terms of the mindless first materialism, then I think you do have this puzzle in its strongest form, because in the mindless first materialism, there's nothing that's conscious that is the same. There's the unconscious changing fields and particles. So there's no way to, I think, to sort of anchor what makes you and me have a common value, unless there's a nature that anchors that is the same between us, and that's the same across time as well.
Well, then what at the most fundamental level gives individuals their value?
I think at the most fundamental level, to use kind of Christian language, it would be something like being in the image and likeness of God. Where by God, what I mean here is the most foundational reality, which is itself, and I talk about this later in the book, the kind of reality that is the locus of conscious experience. And so any kind of reality that is itself constituted out of this substance that can be conscious is a kind of reality that would have value. And I do think that our connection to fundamental reality is giving us the deepest explanation of our value. So you and I have the same value because we have the same nature rooted in the fundamental reality. And that fundamental reality is constant within us. And that's why we continue to have value. We continue to have a constant source of value right within us.
Okay, and then we get to the mind-body problem. So there's various theories of integration, and then you've got your own theory. So if you could talk more about that.
Yeah, thank you. So there's a question now about conscious beings. How do we move these bodies? How are we integrated with these bodies? So I talk about this mind-body problem. And one way of thinking about this problem is in terms of causation. So how is it that my mind can cause my hand to change its form? How does that work? Okay. And I try to think through some different options about how the mind can interact with the body. And to kind of give you sort of three models here. One would be to say that the mind doesn't interact with the body at all. This is called epiphenomenalism. So your consciousness really doesn't make any difference to the material world. Epiphenomenalism, I think, really fits very well with a sort of a mindless versus materialism, where the fundamental reality, the building blocks of reality are mindless. They pull the strings on everything else. That leads to a kind of epiphenomenalism. A different idea is that you are able to affect the material world through your mind. And a version of this would be dualistic interactionism, where the mind is able to affect the body and the body is able to affect the mind. Now, what I say in the book here is that dualistic interaction doesn't really answer how the mind and the body go together. Still leaves it as a mystery, just kind of says they go together somehow, okay? But at least they do go together, right? Now, I mean, a third idea would be that you could have it that the mind pulls all the strings on the body. So this flips the epiphenomenalist picture, where we say the mind doesn't do anything. Here we say the mindless doesn't do anything. The mind does everything. Okay, so that's kind of a symmetrical option there. But again, it doesn't tell us how it does it, and so that leads to the puzzle for the reader. How does the mind and the body go together? And then I try to offer my solution. But well, what do you think about this so far? What's your solution?
What's my solution? I need to listen to you. No, I don't have a solution. So you call yours conscious substance theory.
Yeah.
So, okay, say more about that. What are you getting at
sure.
exactly?
I'd love to. Yeah, thank you. So the conscious substance theory. So this is my solution to the mind-body problem. And let me just say that I became more perplexed by this problem as I studied this topic. I think that I used to sort of think that there's this hard problem of explaining how consciousness could exist in the first place. But once you get consciousness, then there's no problem with mind and body interacting. But I think what happened to me is I began to see that, well, wait a second. What makes the hard problem of consciousness hard is that we're not seeing how we can explain the conscious states just by understanding the material brain states. We're not seeing how to explain, the intention of love out of chemical reactions. We're not seeing that. Well, once you have consciousness in the picture, there's still the question of how you explain the feeling of love from chemical reactions in the brain. I mean, that doesn't go away. There's still a question about how the mind affects the body affects the mind, and then again how the mind affects the body. Because you think about like a conscious state in a dream of like of a mountain. Well, how does that state of a mountain cause a state of a mountain to appear outside of your dream? Like if you want to move your hand, well, how does your wanting to move your hand actually result in your hand moving? I mean, it's still like a mystery, I think. So I became really perplexed by this. I really did. I mean, I was just like, how is this possible? I mean, and even today, I'm still thinking about this because it's like, how does anything do anything? I mean, it almost seems like at some level, it's just magic. It's just like things just do things, right? It's just magic. Well, here's my solution. So I try to minimize the magic, right, as much as I can. At some level, I think that there are what I'm going to call basic capacities to perform basic action. A basic capacity to form a basic action is a capacity to do something in a basic way without analyzing it in terms of more basic action. So if you think about like building a city, for example, I don't know how to build a city with one action. The building of a city involves building houses, building roads. How do I build a house? Well, building a house is not a basic action either. It's not just a single action. You build, but eventually, if you build a city, you're going to build the city by taking some basic actions. And what are the most basic actions? This is where the conscious substance theory comes in. I argue that there's a single kind of substance, conscious substance. So there's not multiple kinds of substances that have to go together, just one kind. And this kind of substance has some basic capacities to form certain states of consciousness. Okay. So it's a conscious substance. It forms consciousness generically, but then within consciousness, it can form certain states of consciousness. And it's still open to me, like what the most basic states are. But like one idea would be maybe there's a basic state of like intending to love, to attract or to repel might be like another, to resist might be another sort of basic state of consciousness. And out of these basic states of consciousness, I think that we can analyze the interaction between bodies and minds in terms of a conscious substance having basic capacities to form both states of body and states of mind and link those together. So it's not that the bodily state causes a mental state or that a mental state causes a bodily state. It's not that. It's that there's a substance that has a basic capacity to cause both mental states and bodily states and to link them together in systematic ways. And so in a way, I sort of think about it like creating programs for interaction, and that the brain is actually a very advanced set of programs that allow us to interact with the environment. And the brain actually emerges out of this conscious substance. So there's a way in which, we actually develop our own brains given the kind of substance that we are. Now, this is, let's say, in cooperation with God substance or with, other substances. I'm kind of leaving that open. But the idea is that you need a certain kind of substance that they can link together mental and material states. And this, I think, gives a solution that posits the least magic, if I can use that language. The least magic. Every other theory seems to posit more types of beings, more types of materials. I want to minimize the types of materials and just say whatever it is at the base, it's something and it has some capacities to do something, and everything else can be analyzed in terms of its basic capacities.
Well, how then do you define substance? I mean,
a substance is just something that has states. That's my minimal definition. It's just something that has states. So I'm a substance because I have states. Now, you could ask me to elaborate on that. I mean, can states have states? Okay, well, it's something that has states that's not itself a state of something more fundamental, if that makes sense. It's the thing that has the states. States maybe have states, but it's the first order reality that has states. So like water would be a substance that can have a state of being wet or frozen. I'm a substance that I can have a state of thinking, a state of feeling. That's what a substance is, in my view.
So could you have a non-material substance then?
Yeah, absolutely. You could have a substance that has a state of thinking and feeling, but it doesn't necessarily have a state of spatial orientation or what we might call material. Yes.
Okay, so it could include particles. I mean, we have
Yeah.
particles that don't have atoms as part of them, right? So,
Yes.
okay.
So particles could also be considered substances. I mean, I guess my actual view of it is that, I mean, and this isn't required for the main journey of the book, is that particles themselves, this is just kind of the spookiness of quantum mechanics. And just this is not my area of expertise, but from what the experts are telling me, it seems like the particles don't sort of like exist in their own right, but seem to depend on something prior. And my analysis of that is that particles aren't really even substances, that they are actually states of something more fundamental. So I have sort of a state analysis of particles. So I don't even think particles are substances.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. But they could be. I mean, you could think that they are, and that's fine as far as my main theory goes.
All righty then. And can you say more then about the question you asked is what makes a body alive?
Yeah, so I think consciousness is what fuels the life of a body. I think it's really is like, what makes a plant different from a waterfall? I think some sort of consciousness fuels the activity of living organisms or living entities, including plants. So yeah, I do think plants have a form of consciousness, maybe not the way that we would have consciousness, but there's an attraction to the sun, and I think it actually feels a certain way to the plant. I think if there were no consciousness, all you'd have is machine-like mechanisms, and then in that case, I wouldn't say it's really alive. It's more imitating life. Um, so that's my view. Consciousness fuels life.
Okay. And let's move on then to the self. We're getting more specific. What are your thoughts on the self, yourself? And that is, you talk about oneness, point of view, and your ability to be self-aware.
Yeah, yeah. So these are arrows to the self. So the self I'm thinking of as a unifier of consciousness. And why I think there is a unifier? Well, self-awareness gives you some insight into that which unifies your consciousness. So I think you could be aware of that unification through self-awareness. A point of view is a perspective that unifies many different states of consciousness. And many of those states come together into a point of view that you have. And so I think of these as arrows that kind of point to your oneness. Oneness itself is again pointing to the unification. You're not 10 things. There's one you. But there's lots of particles, there's lots of thoughts, there's lots of feelings. So where's the oneness? Well, it's the you. Okay. The you is the thing that's one. And so, yeah, it's the unifier. You are the unifier of the many elements within consciousness. And this is so important because people think that if they can analyze consciousness and understand consciousness, they've solved every question that there is. But there's something else.
Okay. So in part two, then, you're dealing with origins of persons, moving beyond nature. So how do you understand the construction problem and mind making?
So the construction problem is the problem of how beings like us could be constructed. How could we come to exist, really? I mean, you just see leaves blowing in the wind. Will those leaves produce a conscious being who can wonder, how did I get here? Is that even possible? So there is a question, like, how could you create a conscious being? Now, let's say you go out into a sandbox and somebody says, I'll give you $1 million, $1 billion, if you can take the sand and turn it into a conscious being. Could you do that? How would you do that? Now, maybe what you could do is you could take that sand, you could organize it into some kind of like computer chip or something. Or you could put like a face, like a smiley face. You say, the sand is happy. See, it's smiley face, right? But you would understand that it's just a simulation of happiness. It's not really having the feeling of happiness. And you can make that simulation more and more complicated to the point where it even is acting. Let's say you get the sand into a machine structure. So the sand acts like it's conscious. That doesn't make it conscious. And I spent some time arguing that this is a huge challenge to see how it would be possible to create a conscious being by any possible means. So that's the construction challenge. And I go through the different aspects of consciousness, constructing thoughts, constructing feelings, constructing your value, constructing the rationality of a thought out of unrational, mindless parts. Each one of those presents a separate challenge. And at the end of the day, that challenge is so severe that you could argue that it's just not even possible to construct a conscious being, just not possible. Um, but it is a question how because here we are. So how did we get here? Right.
So then, mind making then.
So mind making is similar. How do you make a mind? What is a mind making mechanism? To make consciousness. It's all just part of the challenge. That it's maybe a way of summarizing the challenge. All these elements that occur in your mind have to get there somehow. What makes the mind? You could sort of think of it like this. You could think that the mind is the place in which thoughts, contents of consciousness are born or come into being, right? So you could almost like solve the problem of like how you construct thoughts, how you construct these contents of consciousness if you have a mind, right? But then the whole question is, well, how do you make the mind? You've just pushed the mystery back a step. What makes the thing that makes the consciousness? It's like, if it's the mind that makes the consciousness, well, what makes the mind? How does it get there? So that's a deep, deep, deep puzzle. Deep puzzle.
Okay. And for then, as far as the binding problem, what's key for us to grasp regarding that? And
It adds to the puzzle, right? Because not only do you have to understand how to make the mind, but you have to understand how to make the unification. It's like if you could get a bunch of things to have consciousness, how do you put those things together into a single being? For example, you're having some thoughts right now. I'm having some thoughts right now. You're having some feelings right now. I'm having some feelings right now. There's not a third being that has your thoughts and my feelings. So in addition to your thoughts and my feelings, okay, there's not a third being that has both. But there is you that has both your thoughts and your feelings. There is me that has my thoughts and my feelings. So it's not just that there's thoughts and feelings, there's unifiers of thought. There's things that have the thoughts and feelings like together. And so there's a question of what glues the thoughts and feelings together into a single being. That's the binding problem. Sometimes it's called the combination problem.
okay. And so all these things we're talking about are, philosophers of mind, people studying the human person. These are common problems, common questions that
That's it.
everybody's got to deal with.
I didn't make this up. Yeah, this is well-known territory. The philosophers of mind, they're really wrestling with this. Like, how do we put these things together? What makes them? What binds them together?
Okay, so, and then the unity of a conscious self, that's something beyond binding?
It's related to that. So it's actually part of my solution. It's not a complete solution just yet, but it shows how the self can play the role of the binder. So my view is that there's no way to bind together thoughts, feelings, emotions, mental images into one being unless there is a conscious self that is there to have the thoughts, the feelings, emotions. Like there's this one substance that has those things together and that binds them together. It does kind of relocate the question about like, well, how did the self get there? So it sort of sharpens the construction problem, just like, how did the mind get there? But it does help us to understand that you're not building the self just by taking mindless parts and making them conscious individually. And then it's like there's this weird circularity problem. Let's say you want to build a robot that's conscious. Well, here's an idea. You could have one team of scientists work on building the emotion chip. Okay, so that it's going to make the emotions of the robot. You have another team of scientists work on the thinking chip. So this is the chip that thinks, generates the thoughts. Then you have another group of scientists that creates little mental images and an imagination, so it can imagine stuff, right? Let's say that those scientists all succeed. So there's already a hard problem of how you could ever even create real thoughts, real emotions, real images out of just mindless stuff. But let's just pretend they all succeed. Well, now they bring their chips to the table, and now you've got to somehow put those chips together, the thinking, the feeling, the emotions, put them together so that there's a single being that has all of them, right? And it's like, well, here's a way. If you had a conscious self, that conscious self could have all of them. But your goal was to create the conscious self. So it's almost like you need a conscious self in order to create the conscious self. It's like circular. It's like there's no way really to build a conscious self piecemeal, part by part. It's almost like you have to start with the conscious self. Then you can build thoughts and feelings and emotions out of the substance of that self. They can emerge within its consciousness, but you can't build it the other way. You can't get, even if you have conscious bits, you can't put those together into a unified way. So that's where the conscious self comes in.
Okay. And then views of identity. You got three views of identity related to body, psychological, and soul. And then you talk about the prior identity hypothesis. So if you could flesh all
Oh
that
yeah,
out.
this is great. Each one of those theories of identity are theories to try to understand how you are you, even as your body's changing. Okay, how is it that you maintain being you? And you can say maybe you don't maintain being you. But from the first person introspective awareness, this is the whole first part of the book, I argue that there is a you that has your thoughts and feelings, and you can actually be self-aware of the you. And so what makes you you even as your body is changing? Three different options. One is that, well, as long as your body is enough the same, then you're the same. That's the body view. Now there is that as long as your mind, your thoughts and feelings are enough the same, then it's your psychology that makes you the same. A third view is that there's this other thing called a soul that somehow like carries your identity. And I kind of argue against all three. I'm not like against the soul view. It's just that I think none of those really solve the deep problem. Like, so the soul view kind of relocates it. It kind of just like, okay, well, what makes the soul the same soul then across time? If you just say it's basic, there's no analysis, just is the same. Well, then you're granting actually what I offer is just that there's some prior identity that you are, and there's no further analysis of it. Um, the problem with the body and the psychology view is that they don't account for you being literally the same. Um, if you go into a transporter, like on Star Trek, okay, and it destroys your particles and makes a duplicate of you on the planet, that's not you, that's like a clone of you. Imagine that it makes that duplicate but doesn't destroy your particles. Well, then where are you? It's like there's nothing in the bodily description or even the psychological description that answers which one are you individually, because you could have psychological clones as well. So I think the only way to understand who you are is to have something that has an identity that's prior to your psychology, prior to your body. It's something that just is you. There's no further analysis. It's in a way unanalyzable. It's just you just recognize it. It's like I'm me. Okay, I can't analyze me in terms of leaves or particles or brain chemistry. I'm just me. I'm prior to those other things. Does that make sense to you?
Yes.
Good.
And then your prior identity hypothesis, if you could develop that more.
It's the idea that what makes you you is prior to a bunch of mindless parts. You exist prior to the mindless matter in motion. Your identity is prior, basically.
Okay, and traditionally Christians have argued about dichotomist views and trichotomist views. So how do you understand those in relation to what you're getting at here?
So I sort of think of these as different types of states. Like, so you've got a bodily state, a sort of psychological state, which you could think of that as kind of a soulish state, if you want to use that word, and then maybe a spiritual state. I don't think of these as different parts of you unless we use the word part very, very broadly, to just include different states of you. I don't really have like a dog in the fight over whether it's, two or three. I think a lot of it is just terminological. I'm happy to talk about three different states that go together inside of you, your bodily, psychological, and spiritual states. Um, but just the idea is that you are prior to all of those. Actually, you're the substance or the something that has those states. Okay, so it's not like you're divided into different parts that make you you. It's that you are a single unified reality that, in a sense, makes the parts what they are. You give the identity into your parts as your parts.
But the trichotomists wouldn't they say that that's what the spirit is?
They could say that, yeah. I mean, and I'm happy with that language. It's just I think that because there's different terminology, what I'm interested in, like what we can call it different things, but yeah, you could say the thing that you are is your spirit, and then I'm distinguishing that from the spiritual capacities or spiritual states, like the state of worship, for example.
Right. Okay. And then you're talking about the emergence of consciousness and the three ways it emerges. So how can consciousness emerge from substances of the right kind? And what do you even mean by that, the right
Yeah,
kind?
the right kind. So I don't think consciousness can emerge from leaves. And I don't think it's just a matter of leaves being not complicated enough. I think that leaves are the wrong material for making consciousness. Same with rocks. Now, let me be clear. I mean, I did say I think plants are conscious, but what I'm trying to say when I say leaves is these aren't the materials that generate consciousness, even if leaves, contain consciousness in some way. Okay, so what I'm trying to say is that there are certain materials that they can't be the materials out of which consciousness is made. Like you can't take numbers like number 5 and the number 6, you add them up and you get the feeling of love. Like that. No, no, no. Numbers don't have consciousness. They don't make consciousness. So you need the right materials. And then I say there's a certain kind of material which you know within, which is you, and that's the kind of material. I'm using the word material. It's the reality that can cause there to be states of consciousness. And so that's where I'm thinking these states of consciousness emerge like from you. Um, yeah, it's a self, conscious self. And so there are these theories of emergence. One theory of emergence is called strong emergence. That's where you have some materials and you can't see how consciousness could emerge from those materials, but consciousness just does, even though you don't see how it works. Then there's incongruent emergence, which is it's like you can't see how it would, and you actually can see that it couldn't. And what I want to do is give a theory of emergence. I call it substance emergence, on which you can actually see how the consciousness could emerge from that. So I think we have the experience of having states of consciousness emerge from ourselves, and that we don't see that that's impossible. In fact, we experience that it's actually the case. So we don't need to posit, emergence out of brain activity. We don't need to posit that because we already have direct conscious awareness of states of consciousness emerging out of ourselves. And this is what I call substance emergence, because I'm a substance and I'm the foundation of my own consciousness.
So how does that relate to other thinkers that are dealing with the same issues, your theory compared to theirs?
So David Chalmers, he's one of the most famous philosophers of mind who kind of deals with this question of emergence. And he talks about strong emergence, which I mentioned, which is emergence of consciousness where you don't see how it could emerge, right? And so he ends up saying that in some way, consciousness maybe is a fundamental feature of reality. It doesn't actually emerge out of prior mindless states. And I'm actually okay with that. It's just that leaves open the question, what is the reality that has the consciousness? So if you say consciousness is the fundamental feature of reality, meaning it doesn't emerge from prior states, you could still ask, is there a substance or a something that's not a state out of which consciousness emerges or is related somehow? And so I'm in a way agreeing with Chalmers. I would say sharpening the theory in a way. There are other philosophers who say, well, actually, consciousness does somehow just emerge out of the mindless materials. And two ways this goes. One way is because we can reduce consciousness to arrangements or functions of the mindless materials. And then, we talked about why I don't endorse that reductionist view. The other is it's a kind of, I call it sort of a magical emergence where you can't really see how it would emerge, but it just does. And there I argue that actually there are ways to see that it can't emerge. That's where I have my construction challenges, where I say actually these challenges show not just that we don't see how it could be, but that it just can't. Like you can't get rational thought determined out of non-rational fields. That the thought wouldn't be rational then. It's not even possible. Okay. Um, yeah. So those are some of the other options on the table.
Okay, and then moving on to the big one. So you say this is the hardest question you've ever asked as a philosopher. How could a first-person conscious substance come to exist? And so how do you develop then your source substance theory?
So the hardest question I've ever faced is the question you just asked. How could I exist? How could I come to exist? And what I do in the book is I try to create a constraint in which I think the answer would need to be. And I offer the source substance theory, which I'll describe in a moment. Since writing the book, I've clarified my view on this. I've continued to sort of wrestle with, okay, how does this work within this constraint? And I think I have a clearer model than I had even when I wrote the book.
Oh.
And so I'm going to try to sort of articulate as best I can, like my current answer to the question. And there's sort of different ways of formulating this, but what I would want to say is that source substance theory is the theory that there's a foundational substance that doesn't come from anything else. Okay. We could call this God, for example. It is conscious and it is the foundation of everything else. Okay. So it's a foundational substance. There's nothing behind it that made it. And then in the book, I talk about the idea that in some way, this substance makes us out of its own substance. That's the only way we could be made, is to utilize the source substance. It's the only material that could make us. It's like a flame coming out of a fire. That fire is like the substance of the flame. The flame can't exist apart from the fire substance. It's a certain kind of reality. Where I feel like I've maybe sharpened my working hypothesis is in sort of seeing how this substance, this original conscious reality could constitute different beings. So, when the Apostle Paul talks about it's in him in whom we live and move and have our being. What is that? We have our being in him? What our being? We have our being in him? Well, what is that, right? And it's like, okay, here's an idea. It's like the stuff of existence, the foundational reality, call it God, has a being, has a substance. And that substance is able to constitute different beings. It's able to create distinction even within itself so that they're different beings. And this is where you get the idea of the partitions being posterior to the original reality, that the whole original reality is prior to the particular partitions. And this allows there to be a creator distinction. The whole is just different from its parts. It's distinct from its parts, but is intimately connected to its parts because it's the stuff out of which the parts are made. And so there's a way in which like God is like deeply intimately within us, in a way that's maybe deeper than I've ever imagined. Given my theological upbringing, I sort of thought of God as more transcendent. And I think more recently I've been thinking of God as also immanent within me. And so this is part of my solution, is like the only material that can make you and the only material that can make me is a material that cannot itself be made by anything. And it's a material that is the original material, the foundational material, the original conscious reality. And so that's my solution. The source substance enters into all beings to make them alive. There can't be beings that are alive without God. God has to literally be constituting what we are.
Okay, so yeah, that brings up a lot of issues. Then, I
Yeah.
mean, I
Yeah.
mean, a lot of people would certainly take you to task as a believer of like, hold it, that's not biblical. That's more New Age. That's more Eastern or
This is why
something.
I'm citing the Apostle Paul, that's out of the Bible, right?
Right. And interestingly, to add to that too, at the beginning of that chapter, you also quote the Bhagavad Gita, which is again
Uh-huh.
like, what is he doing? So,
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, the main thing I think is the distinction, because it's one thing to say the Holy Spirit dwells in us. It's another thing to say like the core essence of who we are is the same material as the core material of who God is, the
Yeah.
substance.
Yep.
That sounds like it's blurring the creature creator distinction.
It maybe does blur it, but it doesn't make it go away. And so I think it does blur it, and I'm happy with that result, actually, as controversial as that may sound, because I think that I want to spark people's curiosity, and maybe I need to sort of be okay with a little bit of tension here. I'm very aware, people have told me in the sort of Eastern Christian tradition, Eastern Orthodox, there's more of this concept maybe than in the West. And, I do cite the Bhagavad Gita there because I want to kind of show that this is kind of bigger than Christianity. But I also cite the Apostle Paul because I think it enters into and is consistent with the Christian metaphysic. It's consistent with it in its core, even while I understand there are, different Christians will have different views on this. So I'm not unaware this is going to be sort of a controversial part of the book, but I'm putting it out there that, yeah, there is a kind of blurry distinction. And I think it's blurry. It's especially blurry. Let me just say this, especially blurry if we're so used to thinking that the only way God could be distinct from us is if he's transcendent and wholly other. But there is another notion of distinction in philosophy, which is a little bit subtler. We call it numeric distinction. So the idea is that you could have a statue and you could have clay that constitutes that statue. And the clay is numerically distinct from the statue because it's not one and the same thing, but it's so intimately connected to it that if you move the statue, you're moving the clay. And if you move that clay, you're moving the statue. So it's a deep connection. It's very intimate, but it's not numeric identity. There is still a distinction there. So the idea is that, God is within us, but we are not individually all of God. God is beyond us. He's more than us. I'm not you, you're not me. And so if God is in you and God is in me, God is more than just me. God is more than just you. He transcends us both, but he's also within us both. So he unites us.
Okay, so we're like emanations then of God in your thinking. But you seem like the way you talk about it, you kind of forced in this place where either we're emanations of God or it's something else. I mean, because God could create us in a eminent, whatever the adjective is for emanation, right? There's other ways he could do it.
Well, tell me about that. So what do you have in mind?
Well, I don't know. I mean, things can. I don't know. I don't have a theory on that. I mean,
That's okay.
I guess I was to be created ex nihilo.
Well, that's one of the options on the table, and that's one of the options that, I guess I've come to think that may just be impossible. So you think, well, God is God; He can do anything, but He can't do impossible things. So you say, well, with God, all things are possible. Well, can He create squares that aren't squares? Could He create a movie that has a happy ending and doesn't have a happy ending? Can He make
Right.
Can He make Himself never have existed? It's like, well, I think some things are just not possible things.
Sure.
And so that's really is the question, like, is it possible to create from nothing a conscious being? And I guess I'm inclined to think that it's just not, to be honest. Just it can't happen. A conscious being can only be created out of a certain kind of reality, and God is the only reality out of which we could be made. So that leads me away from the creation from nothing. Now, I don't want to overstate that because anybody who reads my book is not convinced of that, still can fall back on the creation from nothing option. I mean, so that's consistent with my main theories in the book. But just kind of my own personal theory is that I think it's not possible. So
Okay, but then we have, say, our inner substance, the core of who we are, their
yeah,
spirit or whatever,
yeah,
is of the same substance of God. But that
that's it.
doesn't account then for our flesh, our what we're made of.
I agree. Yeah, absolutely.
So
So
God still had to come up with those atoms and arrange them somehow.
yeah, I do think that there are layers to us. And so if sort of the deepest layer of us is the same substance as God, that doesn't account, as you say very nicely, for other layers of us, which what I would say like our bodily form, our psychological form, those things would still have to be created and developed. And I do think that those things are created and developed out of like contents. This is where I talk about the mind body problem, right? How does the consciousness affect the body? How does the body even come to exist in the first place? And so my idea here is that that basic reality is able to form certain states within consciousness. This is how God can be omniscient. This God creates states within his own mind, his own consciousness. These are real states, including states that we would describe as material states. Um, and so I think what I would say to kind of build on what I hear you saying um, is that there are bodily and psychological aspects of us that do have to be formed. So it's like when I think of like God, formed the man out of the dust, and then he breathed, the spirit into man. It's almost like, well, what's going on there? It's like, well, one way of understanding that is that there are these material forms that God is using to kind of add layers to us so we can interact in the world. And then the spirit that God's breathing in is a spirit that comes from his own substance that fills us out.
Yeah, that's some pretty wild stuff.
Yeah, it's wild. Yeah, I agree with that. Definitely wild stuff.
So have you gotten
Yeah.
much pushback, say,
Well,
from
I've
more
actually,
conservative evangelicals?
so I've been sort of surprised in a way that when I would share this with my friends who kind of come out of more conservative evangelical backgrounds, it seems like they would be kind of intrigued by the idea of like God exists within, the God inside. As long as kind of the experience that I get, honestly, is if it sounds too much like what I'm saying is friendly to views that Christian evangelicals would think of as like enemy views, then there's like warning flags and like worries. Um, but but the general idea, I've not really gotten that much of a pushback. I've gotten more of a little bit of a curiosity, which has kind of surprised me. And maybe it's because there's enough within the biblical language of like the Apostle Paul's verse there of in him in whom we live and have our being, that sort of opens up like, okay, God is within us. We already kind of have the idea of the Spirit can be within you, and so I'm not, now maybe I will in the future, but I mean, so far, my experience has been more people being kind of curious, and so you know, um,
Right.
but it could invite some pushback. I mean, I think it really, in a way, should in a way because I mean, what I am saying does deviate from a kind of classical creation ex nihilo view. I call this creation ex Deo, creation from God or out of God.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm certainly going to be thinking more about this one, though.
Yeah,
I would really like to see a bunch of views like this, like yours, and another 10 views related to this: the Constitution, the human person,
yeah,
right? And compare it like 10 views on the human person in relation to that God and creation,
that
et
would be
cetera, et
great.
cetera.
That'd be a great book, I think. Yeah, with like 10 authors and
Yeah,
yeah,
most of those, the 4 or 5 views would not cut it. We need at least 10.
we need
So.
10. I love how you're thinking. You could get this going. You could invite the 10 authors and just create the book for us. We can debate it.
Okay.
I love it.
Okay, well, I think that's a good place to stop then. I'm Dennis Metzler. You've been listening to The Charge. We've been with Dr. Joshua Rasmussen. You can check out his book, follow the link below. It's Who Are You Really? Published by IVP. So, Dr. Rasmussen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Peace to everyone. I'd love to hear from you. Please email me at thecharge.info@gmail.com. Please check out our other videos. Don't forget to hit like and click subscribe.